All right, let's jump right into it. Today we're taking on the incredibly dense 400-year history of the United States, and we're going to distill exactly how it transformed from a few isolated colonies into a modern empire. We're looking at the profound and honestly often turbulent life cycle of a nation that started out as just a scattering of hopeful, desperate settlements and evolved into what a lot of people consider the modern Roman Empire. What you should really take away from this explainer is a clear understanding of the massive, macro-level shifts that built this country step by step.
To wrap our heads around this massive timeline, we're going to sprint through 6 defining eras. We'll kick things off with colonies and first contacts, hit the road to revolution, and then look at forging a new nation. From there, we'll dive into expansion and manifest destiny, the tragedy of a nation divided, and wrap up with the explosive growth of the Gilded Age.
So Part 1, Colonies and First Contacts, the turbulent birth of the American colonies.
We're starting out in the 17th century, right? This was a wildly dangerous time, marked by perilous voyages, violent clashes with indigenous peoples who had already been living in complex societies for thousands of years, and the setup of the very first permanent European settlements on the continent. This timeline right here brilliantly captures the rapid, almost chaotic sequence of those early days. Notice how fast things escalated. You've got Jamestown founded in 1607, mostly driven by a search for wealth, followed pretty quickly by the Puritans setting up Plymouth in 1620 to find religious freedom. But then look at 1619. That is the fateful introduction of African slavery to Virginia, an institution that would completely shape the country for centuries. And by 1675, you're already seeing King Philip's War, a devastating conflict between the colonists and native tribes over land and basic survival.
Which brings us to the real economic engine of the era, and yeah, it's incredibly grim, the triangle trade. This was a grotesque cycle of commerce that absolutely fueled rapid colonial expansion. It worked like this. Slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas, where ships would then load up on sugar bound for New England. Finally, rum and other goods were taken back to Africa to trade for more slaves. It was a literal machine generating immense wealth for the colonies, but at an unthinkable human cost.
Because of that booming economy, just look at the sheer velocity of this growth. The colonial population absolutely exploded from roughly 250,000 people in 1700 to over 1.25 million just 50 years later in 1750. This staggering growth made the colonies incredibly valuable to the British Empire. But it also set the stage for major conflict. I mean, a population this large and this self-sufficient, they naturally start to chafe under outside control.
Moving on to Part 2, the road to revolution, taxation, tension, and the break from Britain. Okay, so Britain is sitting on this massive pile of global war debt from the 7 Years' War, and they need revenue, badly. So what do? They hit the American colonists with a cascading series of acts and taxes. You've got the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. But for the colonists, it actually wasn't just about the money. It was about the total lack of consultation. This directly sparked that famous rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." Tensions just kept boiling over into violence, like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where 5 colonists were killed by British troops.
And that brings us to the breaking point. The moment things truly tipped over the edge. 342. That's how many crates of British tea the Sons of Liberty dumped right into Boston Harbor. Just to put that into perspective for you, that destroyed tea would be the equivalent of $1.7 million today. Britain was outraged, of course, and responded with the Intolerable Acts, which effectively punished Massachusetts, but ended up forcing the colonies to unite and form the Continental Congress.
That takes us right into Part 3, forging a new nation, creating the United States of America.
After the fighting actually kicks off at Lexington and Concord, the famous shot heard round the world, this isn't just a rebellion anymore. It's a full-blown revolution, and a revolution requires a completely new system of government. A new nation needed a new ideology. This iconic declaration, penned mostly by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, really anchored the ideological shift of the war. It wasn't just a fight over taxes anymore, it was a fight for sovereignty and natural human rights. This profound idea is what united those fractured colonial militias under General George Washington, giving them the unified purpose they needed to endure brutal winters, secure a French alliance, and ultimately defeat the British at Yorktown.
But here's the catch. Winning the war actually brought on a brand new crisis. The first government they set up, under the Articles of Confederation, was incredibly weak. It totally flopped. It couldn't handle domestic disputes, couldn't handle foreign policy. This led to fierce, fundamental debates over how much power a new federal government should actually wield. You had Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, pushing hard for a powerful central government, going head-to-head with anti-Federalists who fiercely wanted to protect state control.
So how do you fix it? Well, the compromise that practically saved the young nation was a brand new constitution. To balance these deep fears of tyranny with the very real need for a functioning state, they did something radical. They divided federal power into 3 distinct branches, with built-in checks and balances. You have the legislative branch to make the laws, the executive to enforce them, and the judicial to interpret them. This was a totally new design for a government, entirely rooted in the idea of being by the people, for the people.
All right, Part 4, Expansion and Manifest Destiny, Pushing the Borders to the Pacific. As we roll into the 19th century, this fragile new nation starts looking west, and they are fueled by a ravenous desire to conquer the continent. Enter manifest destiny. This concept was the driving force of the era, the core, unshakable belief that the United States was destined to spread its values, its economy, and its people across the entire continent. This mindset drove rapid, aggressive territorial grabs, starting with the Louisiana Purchase, which literally doubled the nation's size overnight, and culminating in conflicts like the Mexican-American War, which added territories like California, Texas, and New Mexico to the map.
Now, we absolutely have to note the grave reality of this expansion. The U.S. government systematically displaced indigenous tribes to clear the way for white settlers. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced tens of thousands of Native Americans to abandon their ancestral lands. That grueling journey west, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in roughly 15,000 deaths, and it effectively ended Native sovereignty over vast stretches of the continent.
To really grasp the economic magnet pulling so many settlers into these incredibly dangerous Western territories, just look at this number: $550 million. That is the astonishing estimated value of the gold pulled out of the earth during the California gold rush by the end of the 1850s. It triggered a massive population boom in places like San Francisco and drastically sped up the development of cross-country travel and communication, which brings us to Part 5, A Nation Divided, the Civil War, and the Fight Over Slavery.
So, as the country is rapidly expanding westward, the fragile political balance back in Washington completely collapses. And it collapses over one deeply ingrained institution: slavery. The irreconcilable difference between these two regions was stark. You had the North, which was rapidly industrializing, focusing on railroads and infrastructure, and they end up electing Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery. Then you had the South, with an agrarian economy entirely dependent on the brutal system of chattel slavery. When Lincoln was elected, Southern states, terrified of losing their economic system and way of life, seceded from the Union. This directly triggered the bombardment of Fort Sumter and the start of the Civil War.
The ensuing Civil War literally tore the nation apart. It was, and still is, the deadliest conflict in American history. We're talking a staggering 600,000 people dead. The North, led by Generals Grant and Sherman, prosecuted a total war against the South, fighting relentlessly until Confederate General Robert E. Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865.
Out of all that immense bloodshed came monumental constitutional changes. The 13th Amendment legally ended the institution of slavery in the United States once and for all. This launched the deeply turbulent period known as Reconstruction, where the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed to secure citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved Black Americans. Though, as the sources clearly note, these new rights faced immediate, violent backlash from white supremacist groups in the South.
Finally, we arrive at Part 6. The Gilded Age: Wealth, Industry, and Inequality. The political compromise that ended Reconstruction in 1877 opened the door to a completely new era, characterized by massive industrial booms, incredible wealth, and severe social disparities. With the country united again, rapid mechanization and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad just completely transformed the economy. Check out these mind-blowing leaps in production over just 3 decades. Coal output is up 800%. Railway track is up 567%. The United States literally became an industrial powerhouse overnight, drawing in millions of immigrants looking for opportunity and drastically shifting the nation from a farming society to an industrial juggernaut. But As you might guess, this massive GDP growth came with a pretty dark side. The wealth was shockingly concentrated. Look at these figures. The top 10% owned 75% of the entire nation's wealth. Industrial moguls, often called robber barons, were building these massive monopolies, while the working class, many of them new immigrants, faced extreme poverty, incredibly dangerous working conditions, and slums. This intense inequality led to massive, violent labor uprisings like the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike, as workers were literally fighting for basic survival.
So, from a few desperate colonies barely surviving the winter, to a fractured nation fighting a bloody civil war, all the way to a mechanized, continent-spanning empire, the American experiment has survived some truly intense growing pains. The infrastructure, the economy, the very soul of the country was forged in the fires of conflict and compromise, which leaves us with one incredibly powerful question to ponder today. Considering everything it took to get here, what does the next chapter actually hold for this modern Roman Empire? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this visually guided journey helped bring this massive history into focus for you.